Turn it on. Turn it off. I checked it, but I thought we had it off because we weren't streaming yet. So I turned it off, saved the battery. Okay, well, we're welcome to this Bible class this evening. Let's go ahead and have a word of prayer and then we'll get started. Our most blessed Father, thank you ever so much for this opportunity to study your word. We're thankful for everyone who is participating in this class. We hope that it would be very beneficial to us, to help us to understand your amazing ability to fulfill everything that you have promised, your ability to look into the future and to tell us exactly how you're going to fulfill it. And then thousands of years later, we can look back and just glorify you and being able to see how marvelously you actually did it. Be with us the rest of this day. We hope that we would be strong against the evil one. We ask this in Jesus' name, amen. So this class is starting out. I've never taught this class on this material, so this is deep. So you talk about, there's certain classes that I call that are, there's nothing in the Bible that you teach is lightweight. There's first principles and there's some things that are meaty. This is a meat class. There's no way that I can cover all of it. And it's a very unusual topic because we're going to take a look at what we call the intertestament years. The years between the Old and the New Testament. And if you think about it, you grow up and you go through the Bible and then all of a sudden you hit that one white page. And then it's the end, it's Malachi. And then you flip it, there's Matthew, and then you start into Matthew. So you go from the Old Testament to the New Testament as if chronologically they kind of flow, but man, it is so different. The way I've heard it described is very similar to like a Shakespearean play. If you've ever gone to a play, you sit and you have different acts. And in between them, the lights go down. And when the lights go down, it's dark, it's silent, you don't know what's going on, but you know they're resetting in the background. But you can't see what the new scene's going to be and everything about it until the lights come back on, and then you look at it, and the scene's different. Everything is set up as differently. That's kind of a way that we have with the New and the Old Testament. There are so many things that are just different about the New Testament when you open it up and you start looking at things that we take for granted, but sometimes we don't ask the question. For example, where did the synagogues come from? There's no synagogues in the Old Testament. Where'd they come from? Where did this two priest thing come from? High priest, How did that, where does Sanhedrin come from? What is a Sanhedrin? There's no mention of that anywhere in the Old Testament. It's not in Mosaic law. There's no Pharisee, there's no Sadducee, there's no Essenes, there's no Zealots, there are so many things culturally different that when you start reading the New Testament, if you don't kind of have an understanding of what happened in between, because it set the stage for the fulfillment of what God has started. And so we have this period that is usually called a period of 400 years of silence. God went dark. He stopped talking. There's no more prophets. There's no angels. There's no visions. Malachi is the last prophet that speaks, that is written, and that we know absolutely is inspired by God, and then that's it. Historically, if you want to know because Malachi's a prophet, so he's bringing a message from God to the people. Now, it's set in a particular date, but so if you want to go and try to find out, okay, so what was the last historical things going on that were written about, you go to Nehemiah. Nehemiah 13 is when Nehemiah comes, and they're rebuilding the second temple. And they're struggling. They're having a lot of problems. And that fits with Malachi. But it doesn't give you a lot. There's still things that were going on at that time were way different. You had Cyrus, the king, who had given the decree. They go back, they start the rebuilding, they flounder, they start building, they get it built. And then you have a lot of moral issues. They're rebuilding a society. Think about it. They've been dispersed for 70 years, and they're coming back, and they're going to build a government. You're going to get a structure going. You're going to get all these things going. So there are a lot of struggles, but they still, Malachi points out, they're still struggling a lot morally. And then the last part of that message we see is the message about John the Baptist. So, and he refers to it as Elijah. And you probably hear this because when John the Baptist does come, there are some questions about that. But then we go into what I call the interlude. And it sets the stage for some things that are so amazing, but they're very specified. There is no silence in some ways because God, through Daniel, spelled it out. That's what you're going to see tonight. Is how amazing if you take the book of Daniel, and that's like 500 years before Christ comes. Over 200 years before any of this historical things happen, and he nails it. I mean, to a T. But when you read Daniel, you kind of wonder, well, what's going on? Because of some of the imagery. And so that's what we're going to deal with. We're going to go back and forth a little bit between the two chapters, chapter 2 and chapter 8, and look at some things and referencing very historical. And we'll get to that, and I do have the scripture up there. We're going to go all the way through and look at the way that it was setting up and how it unfolded and matching what Daniel had said. We're going to stop right around the Romans when in Pompeii and some things like that. And then we're going to pick up and then go on and look at some of the historical things, the religious. So we're going to look at the geopolitical situation and look at scripture proving that those events actually happened. Look at the historical nations that rose as prophesied by name and everything. And look at some of those things. Some of the things are cool. You're going to just, because you've been taught in school or you've watched in movies some of these things about different, Pompeii. I say the word Pompeii, you probably at least think of at least what? The mountain, the city of Pompeii. I mean, so right away, Cleopatra's dad. Anybody know who he is? Yeah, he's pretty interesting. Cleopatra herself and Mark Antony. I mean, there's some things that roll into this that start to come forward that are foretold already 400 years ago. Now, not by name, by Mark Antony and such. So, we look at that. The silence was broken with Gabriel announcing first off to who? Elizabeth about John the Baptist, and then Mary. So for 400 years, they haven't seen any miracles. Now, our country, we're just now, I think, in 4 years, 3 years, going to celebrate 250 years as a nation. There were 400 years of silence. You think about some of these kingdoms and you think about our own country. What do you remember about 1776? What do we have in common today, this nation, with anything in 1776 and the founders of this, even in 1864? We are not the same nation, are we? I mean, we have the same governing laws, but a lot of those have changed. We have the same constitution, but it's been kind of reinterpreted. But we're not the same. So that's kind of the things that you have to understand. For example, do you know why that the national drink beverage is coffee over tea in America? Does anybody know?
The tax the British were charging us for tea?
The British. Because of the British, they were imposing taxes on it. Remember the Boston Tea Party? Yeah. Who remembers that? And so everything to do with English during the Revolution was thumbs down. So there's so many things that were about England that we rejected as a culture, so we became a coffee-drinking nation. I'm good for that. But that's the type of stuff. Where do the coffee drinkers come from? You see what I mean? So when we look at the day and age when Christ came, and the religious institution and the geopolitical things going on, and you hear this engagement with Jesus battling with the Pharisees, and you understand where they came from. You go, ooh, you have a deeper meaning. When he's dealing with the synagogues, by the time we get done with this, you're going to go, oh, I know where they came from. That's amazing. You'll start to get it. what did they do in the synagogues? Why did they do those things? And so I'm hoping those are the things that we can do. So let's jump in and look at there's two visions that we're going to go back. We're going to look at the two. The first one is called the Great Image. Now that one was a vision that Nebuchadnezzar had, and it was of a statue. And now this is interesting because this is a pagan king having this vision, dream. And look at the difference, but it's telling the same storyline. That's the important part that we're going to try to correlate and show. Because later on in chapter 8 of Daniel, he's going to be very specific about what these beasts were. And he's going to name them by nation. And so that's what's amazing. So from Nebuchadnezzar's view of what he thinks is something that's an important nation, you got to look at some of the ways that a king would look at things. And that's the way the vision is built around because he's the one having it. And so it basically starts out with a statue of a head and it goes all the way down to the feet. And it's noble. And it's of very expensive metals. The head is of gold, the chest is of silver, bronze, things that have value, that are important, but they also have more value than others. And so the different parts of the body become represented of different nations, different sections, and we'll get more into that. So I'm not overlooking at them. I'm not just overlooking it. We're going to come back and look at that. But one of the overall views is what I'm trying to get you to see is the vision that Nebuchadnezzar had was a vision from the point of a king, national ruler, looking at other nations, and then God prophesying and showing very clearly the progression historically of these nations that are coming down the road. But there's something weird. At the very last, they all are destroyed by something that's a rock. What's a rock's value? It's not worth the gold of the head, or the silver of the chest, you know what I mean? And it's cut with no human hands. And it comes out and it smashes everything to pieces. The last kingdom. Now that's the view of a man looking at what God is trying to express. Same type of message. It's the same message. Now this is Daniel receiving this vision, and now he's talking, but this is interesting because now we see God's view of the same vision, except instead of looking at it from the eyes of a man, he looks at it from his historical viewpoint. These are beasts without conscience. Each beast represents a part of one of those nations and part of the statue. They'll correlate. We'll see how that the head correlates with a beast, the chest correlates with a beast, and they correlate. And because they're saying the same story, the unique difference is one is coming from the vision of a man, the statue. The other one is coming from God through the prophet. And he'll build upon more of the one around the beast in explaining more of the historical things. Now that's why it's kind of hard for me not to go too fast or too slow, because I want you to hold and flavor. There's kind of like elements of it you got to hold on to a little bit as we go through, because when it starts to unveil, I hope it just starts to really open up. So we're looking at these world empires, and we're looking at historically the progression. And so what we have on that column there on the left, you see we have the Neo-Babylonian, the Medo-Persian, the Greek, and Rome. And historians this is one thing that Bible scholars, and when I say Bible scholars, I don't just mean religious people, people who can study ancient documents and go figure it out and look at what the person's trying to talk about and correlate it historically and do things, that this is a very agreed upon chart. That the very first one, and it's New Babylon, because historically, you want to be proper, there was a pre-Babylon, a Babylon before it lost its power and then it came back. The newer Babylon, is the one with Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, and where you're familiar. Nebuchadnezzar went in and took Judah off and brought them into captivity. He is represented in the image as the head, and the head as the mineral of gold, so high value. Now in the second one, the beast is a lion. So the beasts are the ones that we're going to look at. because those are the ones that are going to be a little more historical when he starts to call out later on in another vision, and he starts saying certain animals. You're going to know who he's talking about, because you can come right back and say, oh, that's Babylon. Oh, that's Medo-Persian. So the Medo-Persians in the image by Nebuchadnezzar was a chest. It was silver. It's represented in chapter 8 as a bear. Then the Greek, belly, thighs, bronze. It's a leopard. Rome, legs and feet, clay and iron. And it's just referenced as a beast, the fourth beast. You notice something about the metals, though, on those? They're all pure except one. Rome. Rome's iron. How valuable is iron? You don't trade commodities with iron, but it's valuable in a way, isn't it? It's strong. But who would mix clay with iron? That's very defective. That's a weakness. And that's the way they ruled. It's fascinating the way that is a very good description of the very strength of iron, but yet there was this element of weakness in the way that the empire was structured and the way they managed. And so that's the last beast. So this is kind of the image. You want to kind of hold on to this right here. So Daniel, he lived from the Babylonians all the way through to Cyrus. So they're like 4 kings he ended up living under. He was nearly close to, estimated, I think, 80 years of age when he died. Right at when the Medo-Persians came in. And so he saw a lot, serving all these kings. So Babylon, they're represented as the gold. Now, one of the things that's fascinating is that through that vision that's interpreted back to Nebuchadnezzar, is he is described as being, God says in this vision to him, you are the gold standard. It's like, what? There's a lot of things that we just run down the Babylonians about, but there are some parts that it was a greater kingdom in a lot of ways, according to human, not necessarily godly or morally. So it did have a prominence. And so that was interesting that, God placed it as the head. He also gave it of gold. It also is being represented, and the other is a lion. This is the empire. Massive. People on YouTube can't see it, but I can show you guys. But there's Babylon there. Here's Jerusalem. Now this is Judah, which means the tribe, but there's the city of Jerusalem, Damascus. Look at the distance they would travel. So Daniel's here in Babylon, been taken off. Ezekiel's actually down the river here, one of the major prophets. But across here in Iran, up here in the light green, is the meeting. It's really the Medes and the Persians. They kind of coexist and they got along and they kind of came together. You're going to see this because he's going to mention the way he describes them as that's a mixture of power, the Medes and the Persians. But at this time, it was predominantly the Medes were the ones that were in power here, and they're going to be the next one. So he lived during this time. And then, so 539, the Medo-Persian Empire, and actually about 530, they started rising up against the Babylonians. There was a war going on the border. They were pushing in. Belshazzar was the king, kind of ruling for his father. His father went off on a vision quest. I call it that. That's not what they called it. In other words, he just kind of went into like retirement and just gave the rule over to his insane Belshazzar's son. So he's ruling as the king in Babylon. And so this incursion is coming in, these battles. The Persians and the Medes are fighting and taking territory, and he's just oblivious. So this is happening and going on for a little while. The night that Belshazzar has that dream, the handwriting on the wall, Without going to all these scriptural references, I'm just going to paraphrase, tell you about them. You know, what happened was he brings out all the trophies they took from the temple, and he then debases them by using them in a very ungodly way. And all of a sudden, in the middle of this massive banquet, this hand appears out of nowhere. That's why the saying, couldn't you read the handwriting on the wall? You didn't see that coming, right? That's where it comes from. And so this hand writes on the wall, basically says, tonight you're going to die. Nobody could understand it. They had to call Daniel. Daniel's an old man. He comes in the room and he goes, Miko, Mika, Mika, something like that. And then he says, basically, tonight you're going to die. And they thought they were invincible because Babylon had this massive river and moat and walls, and they felt they were impermeable. You could not attack them. The Persians were pretty crafty. The Medes and the Persians, you know what they did? They rerouted the river. The river went down, the moat dropped, and they came under the gate and came in and killed them all. So that is the taking over of by the Persians, the Medo-Persians. What's interesting is the Persians end up kind of going away. They're like a dual king. Cyrus, and I can't remember the Medes king, were working together as kind of a coalition, but it didn't work out so well for the Medes. Persians end up dominating. You never hear about the Medes again. So within about a year, Cyrus is ruling the whole thing. And so that's why it says you'll hear Medo-Persian, and then all of a sudden you'll just hear Persian. But it's important when we look at I almost skipped that explanation to you. But when we get to looking at what Daniel says, I'm going to have to go back and reverse myself because he mentions two horns from that beast, one larger than the other. And one of them is the Mede king and the other is the Persian king. And so that's why I'm like, okay, we got to kind of touch a little on that. So by the rule that they have, if you look at the Persian Empire, now this I think, and I think other historians have said as well, the Persian Empire was one of the best governed. It was the most just. They allowed freedoms that the Babylonians, and well, we don't want to bring up the Assyrians, they were just vile. But they allowed each area a lot of freedom of practicing their own religion. Cyrus said, hey, if we got anything from your temples, no matter what peoples you are, go get your stuff and go home, build your temples, and go back to worshiping the way you want to worship, and set them free. He was the most generous king, and he really, the way he managed was phenomenal. And it set really kind of the gold standard for even Rome. Why Rome kind of ruled the way they did is really kind of based off of Cyrus. So it's kind of interesting. But it set the stage. Now, Cyrus was also prophesied by name. He's the only king in the Bible that's prophesied hundreds of years that was going to come. And God said, Cyrus will rise up and he'll let you come, and it's going to be 70 years. And it was like 70 years that night, and guess who was king? It was Cyrus. So we're not going to get that deep into some of that, so I just want to bring that up. But of course, after a certain point, around 33 to 323, the Greeks, Alexander the Great rises up. Philip the Macedonian from northern part of Greece, Philip rises up and starts a coalition, starts rallying the Greeks together finally. They were very fragmented. And then his father's murdered or dies or whatever it is. And at age 25, he takes over. And he goes to town. And he captures literally what they consider the most of the known. When we say the known world, we're talking historic records that we have, because we know China was out there, but he didn't capture China. But most of the ancient writers and stuff consider this area. But so he is the largest, all the way to India. And we'll look at some of the maps. Now, Greece is very specifically, we look at the image Nebuchadnezzar had. That statue was the bronze and the belly and the thigh, and a leopard. Now think about these animals too. Which is faster, a lion or a leopard? So some of the attributes of these animals really have a lot to do with what God is going to talk about. We're going to read directly in those. So they beat the Persians at the Battle of Issus, and the Artaxerxes, I'm trying to remember who the king was, but he fled, survived that battle. Alexander swung south, conquered all the way through to Egypt, spent his time down there, went on a little vision quest of his own, went out to the desert, went to some sacred place, heard a voice that said he was a god, didn't help his ego any. He comes back, and the Egyptians make him pharaoh, and then he says, okay, it's time to go back. He heads back up, and then he re-engages the Persian king and defeats him decisively. The king flees of Persia. He wants to capture him, but he doesn't want him killed. He wants to respect him. And the sad part is some of his men got a hold of the king of Persia first and murdered him. And Alexander was mad. He killed the men who killed the king. He said no. And his wife and his children, Alexander the Great treated them with great honor and set them up, put them back home. He just rolled in, and people, were like, a lot of them, they just let him take over. And he was a good emperor too. I mean, if you would surrender and submit, he would let you continue to rule as well. Very similar to the way Cyrus was doing. But if you got stubborn like the city of Tyre, he would go to no ends to destroy you and crucify all the people in your city. Don't get him wrong. But at the same time, so he finally did defeat them completely by 331 is when. And so now this is the empire of Alexander the Great to the fullest extent. And you can see the expansion further than the Persians, even coming over there to Greece and Macedonia and Thrace. Remember Thrace. Thrace is going to be one of those that's kind of an important area. You look at that area where it says Lydia there. That, if you recognize, is modern-day Turkey. Asia Minor, where Ephesus and all the New Testament churches that Paul basically kind of sets up, are in this area here. But all of that land there. But, he didn't live long. Age 33, dies mysteriously. Nobody knows. One thing was, by the time they got to India, the men were exhausted. They wanted to go home. They were so far over. They were starting to get typhoid. They were having some issues. And so they get to the Indus River that divided on that boundary there. If you look at that on the southern part, they basically were able, they're also Afghanistan. Y'all remember that little place? Yeah. Even Alexander the Great didn't do too good in Afghanistan. Nobody has. But they basically get down to this region here, pushed over, and that's India. And that's when they made the decision, the generals and everybody got, look, we got to go back. This is not right. And he finally submitted. And as they're turning back at some point, very shortly, he becomes deathly ill. On his deathbed, they're begging him to pick a successor. You need to pick a successor. He had a child and a mother somewhere else, not where they were at. So everybody's like, well, the child will be the successor. He would not pick a successor. So on his death, guess what happened? The generals split it up. They divide up. And this is where it starts to get closer to what is going to be very important to the Bible history. Because the four generals that divide this up, divided up by territories. And most of them you don't know. I mean, they're not that important. Lysimachus, Thrace, Cassandra, Macedonia. Those two, basically Greece. That if you think of Thrace, and then, like I said, hold that thought, Macedonia, and then a little bit over into another region, but very limited. The two big ones, the two big guys that took a lot of the territory was Cilicius and Ptolemy. Those are the ones that are the biggest impactful in history, period, and even the Bible. The Salides, or the Seleucus, is the one that is going to do the most damage. And he is very specifically prophesied about when we start to get in and read these. So it really wasn't until like after, even though they divided it up, there was some skirmishing. There was still some fighting. So as they fought through and settled out, there was some skirmishing, especially the land of Palestine, that strip of land down through around the ridge of the Mediterranean going down to Egypt. Ptolemy takes Egypt. Seleucid takes Syria. But everybody wants that land route. It's fertile and it's critical. Well, guess who's in the middle of it? Judah. So they end up becoming kind of thrown around historically over some years because of the battling back and forth between these two generals that are now kings of their own domains. And so this is the way it kind of shakes out. And you can obviously see the Seleucid general, he took the massive part, and this is the area that's going to go back and forth between these two generals fighting that out. And so that's something to keep an eye on. It's going to impact what's going to happen to Judah, the people in that region there. Ptolemy was a much better governor of that area. He was more pragmatic about the way he would deal with the people there. They had some autonomy, whereas the Seleucids, they didn't. Antiochus, he was horrible. So it's kind of like they go back and forth between the two, but these two are power players on the mark. Rome right now is just a little bitty city over in the Italian area, but they're coming on quick. They're growing in their power, but they don't have the ability to do anything at this time. So let's take a look, because now what we see, and go to 8, because 8 now gives us a historical perspective of what those beasts were. Now, we have a timeline. Daniel says exactly, this is in the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me. So now remember, so that automatically, we know Belshazzar is the last king of Babylon. So it's his 3rd year. And so within a couple of years, stuff's going to start happening. Daniel appeared to me, after which appeared to me at the first. And I saw in a vision. And when I saw, I was in Susa, the citadel, which is the province of Elam. And I saw in the vision, and I saw at the Ula Canal. And I raised my eyes, and I saw, and behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. It had 2 horns. Both horns were high, but one was higher than the other. And the higher one came up last. And I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. No beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased, and he became great. This is the Medo-Persian. So this is within 3 years of when this is going to happen. And so if we go back and the Persians are the ones that are going to rise up. Let me jump over, get back to here. So there's but you notice he says he has 2 horns. Both were high. They're 2 kings, but one was higher than the other. One came up last. So there's one that's going to come up that's going to have more prominence, one king over the other one. And there was nobody that could withstand him. If you jump to verse 20 of 8, we know that the ram, it says, as for the ram that you saw, these are the angels interpreting it for Daniel. These are the kings of Media and Persia. So there's no guessing. I mean, very clearly. And there were the two kings. Cyrus was the Persian that ends up being the one horn that would last. And then he says, as I was considering, a male goat came up from the west, the face of the whole earth, without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came to the ram with the two horns, which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him in his powerful wrath. And I saw him come close to the ram, and as he enraged against the ram, he struck the ram and broke his two horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him. There was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. Now jump down to 21 and 22. This is the explanation the angel gives of what he has seen. The goat is the king of Greece. So who's that? Alexander the Great. And the horn, the great horn between his eyes, is the first king. As for the horn that was broken, in place of which four others arose. Remember we talked about the four generals? See there? 4 kingdoms shall arise from this nation, but not with his power. They took it. That's pretty specific. This is 200 years before this is going to happen. Daniel's having a vision and showing. So if we go all the way back to Nebuchadnezzar, 70 years before, when he had that vision of the image of the statue of these different kingdoms, and then in 8 years later, he has another vision, and then all of a sudden we see again a reinforcing vision showing how these kingdoms are progressively going to come. First, you had the Babylonians, and then you're going to have the Medes and the Persians. Then you're going to have Alexander the Great with the Greeks, and then you're going to have Rome. That's the 4 that are always shown in the prophets, and they lay out perfect. And if you look at that again, you can see that the speed and violence that Alexander the Great came through with was historically amazing. Nobody had ever been able to conquer as rapidly and as viciously in his battles. This guy he reminds me of when you're 25, you don't think you can ever die. He literally, in the battle of Isis against the Persian king, the phalanx is what the Greeks had mastered. So the phalanx was a massive spear in the way they would lay it out. Well, the problem was the Greeks were on the disadvantaged side, and the way that Alexander the Great had set up his regiments, they were supposed to cross this river, but once they went into the water, they were going to have to come up against the Persians. And so his phalanx got across, but the Persians were getting the better of him, and Alexander took his regiment and he led them across. And he ended up getting wounded, and he led them across and punched through, allowed the 3rd division of phalanx to come in and then win. And it was just a battle that nobody would have thought you could have beat, you could have won. Why are you lining up there tactically on the terrain you're lining on? Everything about him was just not to the standards. I mean, people would just look at it and go, how's he doing this? So look at the description. He said, he ran at him with his powerful wrath. I saw him come close to the ram, that's Persian, and he was enraged against him and struck the ram and broke his 2 horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and he trampled him. And no one could rescue the ram from his power. This is 200 years, like I said, after Daniel. Who could have wrote that to be that specific and be able to pick it out? And so these are those 4 kingdoms. Like I said, jump down to 8, the angel interprets it, and so we know very clearly. So coming back, when we look at the Seleucids, they are a very interesting and more debased than the Ptolemies. Like I said, they're from 198 to 63, this Palestine, when I say Palestine, we're talking Judean area. But because if you say Palestine today, it has a different meaning. But Palestine in that timeline was basically that whole strip of land that Judah and Israel were on. And it becomes basically a political football between these two power nations, like I said. In 198 BC, Antiochus the Great, this is the king of Syria, that's where Seleucid basically is Syria. He becomes a ruler, and he is the one that is Cleopatra's father. And he sets up an arranged marriage for his daughter with the king, or the pharaoh of Egypt, who was a Ptolemy, and try to make it, swap your daughter with your son-in-law and all this, hoping that Cleopatra would help persuade or have some power to be able to influence. And Cleopatra flipped on her dad. She ends up not being so daddy-friendly. It's just kind of an interesting aspect. So what's interesting is Cleopatra is not Egyptian. Cleopatra is more Greek, because the Ptolemies, and then if you look at her father, but who would have thought, right? Who thought that Cleopatra would have any Greek? But that's basically her heritage, if you checked her DNA. And to think that the Egyptians and the word Ptolemy doesn't seem to correlate with Egypt and the pharaohs, but really from that point on, once this general Ptolemy takes over Egypt, they just become Egyptian. They take over, and the people there call them pharaohs. Well, the word pharaoh means king, but not in the traditional sense, like a Ramsey or something that you would think about. It's really changing, see, the way that it's happening. He actually came across and takes over Jerusalem for a while, and he actually takes the better of Ptolemy for a while. Ptolemy tries to fight back, but Antiochus just invades Egypt a second time and pushes him back. And he starts to dominate the Palestinian area. And this is setting up, this is important, so it sounds a little dry, but because of what's going to set forward. Because when he came down there, what's interesting is Leonidas was a Roman. This is where the Romans, perk your ear up. This is where the Romans come on stage. What's important about Egypt? Grain, wheat. Oh, it's like the grain wheat basket of the world. And if you look at Roman history, man, if the grain shipments weren't coming into Rome, the people were rioting. And so Rome immediately, they can't produce enough to support their people plus this empire and all the army. So they immediately start to set up relationships and trade agreements with Egypt so they could support their new fledgling empire that's coming up. So they've got this guy Leonidas down there when Antiochus tries to come down and invade, and Antiochus gets approached by Linus, the Roman envoy, and what's interesting is this very famous line. Linus tells Antiochus, you don't want to do this. You don't want to invade. You're going to get us involved, the Romans. Now, for us to hear that, we go, yeah, don't get the Romans involved. They're not that big right now. But you don't want to get us involved. And Antiochus goes, I'm going to have to think about it. And this is a famous thing was, Leonidas said, okay. And he took his sword and he drew a circle all the way around him. And he said, by the time you step out of that circle, you need to have decided. And called his bluff. And Antiochus, with his tail between his legs, pulls out. The bad part was the way it's like a mad little brat on his way back. He goes into Jerusalem and he plunders it. Now, he's already won back that region, but the prize he had was Egypt. So he kind of, the first time through, when this invasion of Egypt, well, guess what? Palestine goes with it. So He's down there. He gets his bluff called. Antiochus is coming back. On his way back, he turns around and he goes out. Now, and I say that because Jerusalem wasn't exactly directly on the highway. It's kind of like, you're going to have to get off and go a little ways. And so, but he does. He goes because he wants the money. If you're going to fund your nation and you're needing money, and he knew Jerusalem was fairly rich, and he plundered it. And so, after plundering it, he decides he wants to unify and solidify Syrian nation, the Seleucid nation empire, by Hellenizing it. Now, there's that word. When you say Hellenize, what do you mean by Hellenizing? This is important. This is really important because this is where it's going to set forward so many things that impact the Jewish people. Because Hellenization basically is saying we're taking everything that's Greek culture and we're going to make everybody practice it. Now, this is where it's fascinating because in Hellenizing or turning Greek, the language becomes the predominant language was Greek. Well, guess what? The Ptolemy were Greek too, right? So down in Egypt, Greek was a very prominent language. Well, guess what? The other generals who went off, who were controlling most of the known world at that time, that when it fragmented apart, they were all what? Greek. So guess what becomes one of the first international languages? Greek. Hold on to that, because you can see where it's going, the importance of that. But in doing so, he just becomes more vile. He sends basically a tax representative after he's plundered the temple, he's gone back to Damascus. He sends back and he goes in and he imposes unrealistic expectations on the people and money. Now, what's interesting is why? What's going on? Oh, those pesky Romans, remember those guys who called his bluff? Well, now they're basically making him pay Antiochus some money to stay out of their hood. You don't want us to come over there? All right, Antiochus, pay us some money. So he's having to come up with tribute to pay to the Romans to keep them out of his neighborhood while he's trying to build his. So where's he getting his money? So while he's trying to Hellenize the culture and do all these things, he imposes a lot of things. And so he goes in, he strips the temple of all of its values. He wants to get rid of the culture. This representative destroys, they massacre over 80,000 people. 80,000. Josephus, the historian, he says that 10,000 were carried away in captivity and sold as slaves. Some estimate even higher. He demolishes the walls to the city. What does that do? That's like taking all your weapons and all your army. You have no way to defend yourself. If we come back, we're going to walk right down your street. He builds a tower and supplies it with armed mercenaries where they can sit there and and you notice it's not armed soldiers, it's mercenaries. So he's paying these guys to sit out there and keep control and keep his thumb on Jerusalem and the Judean region, the Palestinian region there. He desecrates the temple by erecting an image of Zeus in the temple. He is doing everything he can to demoralize the Jewish faith. Everything he can. He then offers a pig on the altar, and he sprinkles pig's blood in the temple. Can you imagine how bad? I mean, because he executes the high priest. He starts killing people who were leaders. And so he just set out on this, I call it a comprehensive plan of trying to force these Jews to think and act like Greeks. This is where some of those that were Jewish and weak faithfully as Jews were starting to buy into it. And you'll see this because the priests are the ones, the Sadducees, are going to develop out of this group that were more Hellenistic. You may recall from the New Testament, in the book of Acts, when they were having problems trying to take care of everybody, and that there was a group of widows that were being neglected, and it was brought to the apostles' attention saying, hey, the Hellenistic widows are being neglected. Wait a minute, they're Jews, right? They're Hellenistic Jews. So even the Greek culture Jews goes on all the way into Jesus' time, and it starts in this timeline. He continues to erect these shrines to Greek deities throughout and demanding people to honor them. He burned copies of the law, and he would execute people that owned them. If he found people that owned them, they were instructed to murder them. He refused to let their children be circumcised and not do it. And not only that, but if he found circumcised children, he would strangle them with their mothers. Do you want to circumcise your child? Is circumcision that important to you? Seriously. Your child lives, you live, you just don't cut the skin, or you follow your faith, you follow what God wants, and you circumcise your child. You think Moses and the Egyptians had it rough? This is a history during the silent years, okay? But this sets the mindset because it's going to get worse. It's like it just keeps. So now when we come back, remember we talked about the division and the way this breaks up. Let's go back over to Daniel 8. Go back, we read this, but starting in verse 8, then the goat became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken. And instead of there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of the heaven. That's the map we looked at. Look how specific, again, you can sit and see over, again, 500 years. And he's describing, again, very much. But look at 9. This is what happens. Remember the Seleucids that take over that area? Look what 9 says. Out of one of them came a little horn. I love that. It's almost like an insult, isn't it? You're just a little man. The little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south. That's down toward Jerusalem. He started going forward toward the east and toward the glorious land. It grew great, even to the host of heaven. And some of the host and some of its stars were thrown down to the ground and trampled on. It became great, even as great as the prince of the host. And the regular burnt offerings were taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. Everything was destroyed. This is a destruction of the social classes of the Jews. He destroyed the princes and the murdering, all of this stuff. And then he starts to elevate himself as a god. He actually injected in his own name, Antiochus Epiphanes was his name, but Antiochus Theos, God Epiphanes. So he was raising himself up as a host, and he took away all of the offerings, and that historically is exactly what was documented. And he says, and a host, starting in 12, chapter 8, and a host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offering because of transgression, and it will be thrown to the ground, and it will act and prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to one who spoke, for how long is this vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate? In other words, what Antiochus did, the 2 angels are going, how long is this going to last? How long are we going to put up with all this, the basement of the temple and everything? And then he said, it's given over the sanctuary, and the host is trampled underfoot. And then 14, he says, and then he said to me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. So now we got to find that, right? So from 170 BC, it was retaken in 164 BC. So from 170, when Antiochus came in and defiled it, executed the high priest, to 164 BC, when Judas Maccabeus, we're going to talk about him, reestablishes the sacrifices. You know how long that was? 2,300 days. Again, this is written over 400 years before this happens, and that's what Daniel was told when the angel, when he asked, how long is this going to go on, this horrible thing with all the tabernacle and the sanctuary being trampled underfoot? And he says 2,300 evenings and mornings. Can't get much more specific, can you? So now this is where we start to see the foretelling of this revolt that kicks up. Over in chapter 11, it says, forces shall appear and profane the temple. He's repeating the history here, okay? So when here, we jumped over to chapter 11 now, but he's saying now, he kind of repeating what Antiochus did. Forces shall appear and profane the temple and the fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering, and they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. He shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant, but the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. So, it started in a little village, Modin, 20 miles northwest of Jerusalem. There was Apelles, Antiochus' general, came to this little village and demanded that they offer a sacrifice on a pagan altar. He wanted a leader, because it's kind of like the old thing, you know, like you get the leaders to do it, then everybody else is going to follow. They wanted one of the main leaders, and they wanted a priest to do this. And Mattathias was offered this sacrifice to do it and a bribe, and he refuses. He won't do it. So after he refused, another Jewish man does it. He goes ahead and satisfies it. Well, Matthias and his 5 sons, they killed the traitor, this Jew, killed the general, and killed all of his soldiers. They're like, no. It's one thing, I'm not going to do it. And then some other guy comes like, I'll do it. And he did it. And that man, it just incensed Mattathias. And so Mattathias, Maccabee, and his sons just slaughter him. Well, that ain't going to go real well. You know what I mean? You know, but it's amazing because of the courage. So they leave the village. They take off. And they head for the Judean hill country, which, if you remember David, when he pursued, it was a little hard area if you're going to try to track somebody down, especially they knew the area. So the months that follow, you find a guerrilla warfare that starts happening. And they call out, and they grow, they go up against a much stronger force, the Syrian force. But what's amazing is the ranks continue to grow and grow and grow. About a year after this started, Mattathias becomes terminally ill, and he appoints his youngest, one of his sons, Simon, as an administrator of this rebellion, the guerrilla warfare. His oldest son, though, he appoints as a general of the army, Judas. And Judas ends up earning the name Judas the Hammer because of his phenomenal combat skills and his tactics. And his victories were he was slaughtering the Syrians. So Judas Maccabeus, under his leadership, he recaptured the temple, like I pointed out earlier, 164 BC. And in 25th of Kislev, which is December, worship to Yahweh was reestablished. How many days? 2,300. Exactly what Daniel said it was going to be. And he reestablished. That, of course, created a celebration, and it lasted for 8 days. And it included fasting, singing, sacrifices, And then it turns into an annual celebration, which it is big. I mean, they destroyed people who defiled the temple. They were able to reestablish the sacrifices. So it became a very important part. Now, you're probably more familiar with it. It's called Hanukkah. That's where Hanukkah comes from, the Festival of the Lights. All of it kind of coming together. But I want you to remember, don't forget, even if you can't remember all these names and stuff, I want you to just hold in your mind the amazement of how Daniel so specifically was pointing out these nations that God was revealing. And then we could go historically and we're showing this is where it was fulfilled. Never said it was going to be the Maccabees, but he very clearly said there were people who would be strong and they'd stand up. How long was it going to last? How long was this abomination going to happen? 2,300 evening and nights. That's exactly what happened. So it celebrates the cleansing of the temple under Judas Maccabeus. So the Maccabees ruled from 165 to 163, and their descendants led. It seems like, not a real long time. They did get some independence. Now remember, they may have won the battles, but they were never going to win the war. Syria was just getting a lot weaker. They had this pesky empire coming up on the horizon called Rome. Now this is what's a little ironic too, that while the Jews were struggling between this power struggle between Ptolemy and Seleucids, that they were struggling, they actually reached out to Rome and said, hey, you think you guys could help us? Isn't there some irony in that one? And they said, we're real busy right now. We'll get back to you. And boy, did they. But they did gain some independence. But then around 63 BC, Judea and Jerusalem, because of Syria collapsing and Rome taking them, couldn't pay enough tribute to them. Rome decides, hey, time to expand a little out there. They take them. Well, by default, guess what they inherited? This little independent area that the Assyrians had kind of said, well, they killed a bunch of our guys. We're just going to let them kind of have their own time. And so they ruled, they were independent, but they were still kind of vulnerable. So when Rome took over Syria and all that area, they looked south and they're like, Pompey goes, we got to do something about those little guys down there. We got to, it's a bridge to Egypt. Always think Egypt with the Romans when you start coming around this area because of the food. And so there's a lot of reasons they want that. And so under that occupation, by default, they had to do something about it. One of the things that triggers in 63 that slows it down slightly is the civil wars. Caesar was murdered, and then Octavian, his nephew, Pompey, and some of the other generals had split, and a civil war ensues. But overall, just for time's sake, Octavian wins, the nephew. He becomes Caesar Augustus. He will be the Caesar. No, it won't be him. He'll die just before Jesus comes. But this is where we start to tie it in closer. We're getting close to the end. Octavian, or Augustus, awards an Antipater for his help. And what he does is he appoints his son, Herod, to be the governor over Palestine. Later, this guy's going to be called Herod the Great, not because of his moral values, but because of his building. He takes and builds onto the temple. That was amazing. He was brilliant but brutal, as they describe. They say, he had 10 wives. Memory, he loved passionately, but he suspected her of infidelity, so he had her executed. 7 BC, had his own, he had her 2 sons executed. 4 BC, he ordered the execution of the babies in Bethlehem that were 2 years and younger because he heard some king was born there. So he killed all the babies under 2. 4 BC, 5 days before his death, he He ordered the execution of his favorite son. And just before his death, to cap it all off, he had 80 of the prominent Jewish leaders executed. And everybody's like, why? Because he wanted people to mourn him when he's dead. Nobody would be mourning, but he could make them mourn if he slaughtered their leaders and stuff. So they would be sad, they'd be mourning, not for him as much, but that's the type of sicko this guy was. I want to wrap it up by, looking at something. There's 3 different passages and it's kind of summed up, but I think Isaiah 45:21 says it about God. Declare what is to be presented. In other words, he's talking about prophesy, tell something. Declare what is to be and present it. Let them take counsel together. Who foretold this long ago? Who declared it from the distant past? Was it not I, the Lord? And there was no God apart from me, a righteous God and a Savior. There is none but me. And God is challenged. He's thrown down the gauntlet through Isaiah saying, look, I'm telling you what's coming up. Who can do that? Who can do that? All right, that was another kind of a long class.
What was that verse? Isaiah 45, what?
It was Isaiah 45:21. It's not necessarily, it's probably better almost paraphrase. There's 3 of those that I can't recall the other 2. But they're basically, God is saying, who's been able to tell you about the future except me? And that's what we've seen tonight. We're going to tie in and start to dig in on, we've looked at the political, geopolitical, and then next week we're going to look at the religious implications from the Hellenization, what it had an effect on, and where these different parties grew out of. The Sadducees, Pharisees, the Essenes, the synagogues, and all this stuff. But the other key part is, remember, God is fulfilling his promise all the way back to the garden. And that is to bring the king, bring the Messiah, right? And even though it's a quiet time of the years, oh man, he's busy. It shows a couple of things. It shows, one, God is fulfilling it in spite of. He's bringing nations down and judging them. And he is using sinful things to then execute his judgment upon. And it's amazing that on the other end of it, he takes the end product and makes it a better path to help fulfill what he's doing. And the synagogues are one of those. So that's what I hope we'll get out of it. Well, okay, next week we'll probably finish it. If you've got questions or things like that, ask. It's a lot, I know, but hope you'll be here at 9:45 for Bible study, 10:45 for worship, and next week, 4 p.m. in the afternoon, we're going through the book of Isaiah. So kind of interesting, tying them together. So until then, God bless.